Imagine a throne room so silent you can hear the candle's breath. The most powerful man in the known world is seated at its center, and he is talking to a mirror, not rehearsing a speech, not admiring his robes. He is consulating it, tilting his head, pausing, nodding, as if the reflection has answered him. The generals standing at the door exchange a look. Nobody speaks. Nobody dares speak, because the last man who contradicted the Sultan was carried out of that same room in pieces. This is not a legend. This is not folklore. This is the documented collapse of an Ottoman Sultan's grip on reality. A slow, suffocating unrevealing that happened not in secret, but in plain sight inside the most powerful imperial court in the world. And the terrifying part, everyone around him watched it happen. They watched and they said nothing, because silence in the Ottoman palaces was always safer than the truth. To understand how a sultan breaks, you first have to understand what it means to become one. The Ottoman succession system was, by deliberate design, one of the most psychologically brutal institutions in human history. The princes, the Shahzades, were raised in relative isolation, surrounded by tutors and servants, always watched, never fully trusted. They were educated to rule empires. They were also educated to understand that their brothers were their most dangerous enemies. For most of the Ottoman history, the law was explicit. When a new sultan took the throne, his brothers were strangled, not out of cruelty, or not only out of cruelty, but out of cold political logic. One throne, one man, no rivals. This is the world these men were born into. By the 17th century, that law softened, but it was replaced by something arguably worse: the kafes, the cage. Princes who were not executed were instead confined to a section of the Topkapi Palace, isolated, watched, cut off from governance, from warfare, from any real contact with the world. They might one day rule. They could have concubines. They had servants, they had food and books and walls. What they didn't have was reality. Decades sometimes passed in that gilded cage, and then without warning a prince would be pulled from isolation, dressed in imperial robes, and placed on the most powerful throne in the world, expected to command armies, expected to adjudicate disputes between grand viziers, janissary generals, and ulema scholars, expected to be sharp, decisive, magnificent. And some of them were, remarkably. Some emerged from the cage with their faculties intact, their minds hardened rather than hollowed, but some did not. The psychological damage the kafes inflicted was profound. Historians studying this period, including Leslie Pierce and Baki Tazcan, who examined Ottoman court dynamics extensively, have noted the recurring patterns: sultans prone to paranoia, prone to irrational rages, prone to placing absolute trust in the last person who spoke to them, men who had spent their formative years unable to trust anyone, emerging as rulers who trusted no one, or far worse, trusted the wrong people completely. This is the soil in which our story grows. When you are sultan, there is a specific, insidious problem that no one prepares you for. Everyone lies to you. Not maliciously or not always, but systematically, structurally, inevitably. The men around you know your moods, they know your fears. They know which words make you reach for your signet ring and which make you reach for executioner's ledger. And so they calibrate, they adjust, they tell you what keeps them alive. Court chronicles from this era, preserved in the Ottoman archives and studied by historians like Rhodes Murphy and Colin Imber, describe a culture of performative loyalty that was elaborate, ritualized, and fundamentally dishonest. Grand viziers drafted reports, But before those reports reached the Sultan's hands, they passed through layers of palace secretaries, chamberlains, and royal attendants, each of whom had their own alliances, their own rivals, their own agenda. What reached the Sultan was rarely the raw truth. It was curated version of the truth that had been softened, redirected, prone of anything that might provoke a dangerous reaction. And a ruler who only receives curated truth across months, across years, eventually stops being able to distinguish it from reality. The mirror begins before the literal mirror. It begins in the throne room, when every face around you reflects only what you want to see. Now add to this specific terror of the Janissaries, the Janissary Corps. Now add to this the specific terror of the Janissaries, the Janissary Corps, the elite infantry that formed the backbone of Ottoman military power, had by the 17th century become something far more dangerous than soldiers. They were a political force. They had deposed sultans before. They would depose sultans again. Every ruler knew this, and knowing it, many rulers made the same catastrophic calculation. Keep the Janissaries happy, not effective, pay them. Flatter them, don't push them. The result was a military that was becoming structurally hollow at precisely the moment that external threats, the Habsburg Empire, the Safavid Persians, and increasingly assertive Venetian navy were sharpening. A ruler with a firm grasp of reality might have recognized this and acted, but a ruler already drifting from reality, he would rely on reports that told him his enemies were magnificent, because that's what the reports said. Let's talk about what paranoia actually looks like in a man with absolute power. It doesn't arrive all at once, it doesn't announce itself. It begins as heightened caution, reasonable, even admirable. You are surrounded by rivals, you have seen plots unfold, you know how quickly fortunes reverse in a palace. Vigilance is survival, but vigilance without an anchor in truth becomes something else. The first sign was subtle. Appointments began shifting. Trusted advisors who had served faithfully for years were quietly sidelined, replaced not by more capable men, but by more agreeable ones. Men who nodded, men who affirmed, men whose faces never clouded with doubt. Court observers, and Ottoman court always had observers, always had men writing things down in private, always had the discreet voices of the harem intelligentsia. Noted the change. The Sultan's inner circle contracted, the radius of trust shrank. Then came the purges. Historical accounts from the period describe a series of sudden, seemingly inexplicable dismissals and executions of high-ranking officials. Grand viziers removed after brief tenures. Military commanders recalled from campaigns on vague accusations. Religious scholars who had given unfavorable opinions quietly vanishing from the public life. On paper, each decision had a rationale, but the pattern told a different story. The pattern said, I do not trust anyone who challenges me. And when you remove everyone who might challenge you, what remains is not loyal counsel. It is an echo chamber, a room full of mirrors. Here is where the documented phenomenon becomes genuinely haunting. Primary sources from this period, including accounts preserved in the Naima Tahiri, one of the most significant Ottoman historical chronicles, compiled by Mustafa Naima in the early 18th century from contemporaneous records, describe a sultan whose behavior in private audience grew increasingly erratic. He would ask the same questions twice in the same meeting as if he hadn't received an answer the first time. He would dismiss officials mid-sentence and then summon them back hours later to continue a conversation he had apparently been rehearsing alone. He became obsessed with loyalty testing, asking deliberately contradictory things of different advisors to see whose account matched worse. But because everyone around him had learned to give agreeable answers, the accounts all matched, not because they were true, because they were coordinated. He took this coordination as evidence of honesty. It was in fact evidence of conspiracy, just not the conspiracy he feared. The mirrors. The accounts don't give us a single dramatic moment where a sultan first began to speaking to reflections. History rarely does, but what the sources describe the gradual preferences for solitary private chambers, the extended hours spent without company, the dismissed servants who heard muttering from behind closed doors suggests a man whose inner dialogue had become his primary dialogue. When the world outside lies to you, when every face you see has been pre-arranged to reflect back comfort, there is a terrible logic to turning inward. At least your own reflection cannot conspire against you. At least the mirror is consistent. The psychological parallel to what modern clinical literature would recognize as a paranoid episode is striking. The grandiosity, the persecution complex, the magical thinking, the belief that the pattern you see is the pattern that exists, regardless of country evidence, the narrowing of the trust to the point of isolation. These are not formal these are not moral failures, these are predictable consequences of a specific set of conditions: extreme power, extreme isolation, and the systematic replacement of honest feedback with flattery. The Ottoman court had, in its elaborate structure, accidentally built a machine for producing these conditions, and the Sultan was inside it. Empires do not collapse from the outside first, they collapse from the inside. By the time of Sultan's psychological deterioration became impossible to ignore, the damage was already structural. The man who should have been in positions of authority, competent administrators, battle tested generals, honest legal scholars, had been replaced, retired, or executed. What remained was a class of officials selected almost entirely for one quality: the willingness to agree. This is not a metaphor. This had measurable, catastrophic consequences. On the military front, the hollowing of real command authority means that the campaigns were planned, approved, and executed based on reports that bore only a passing resemblance to battlefield reality. Logistics failures were underreported. Enemy strength was consistently minimized. Ottoman armies, still formidable in size, were being sent into engagements based on assessments that no longer reflected the terrain, the weather, or the opposing force. Losses followed, and losses required explanation. The explanation delivered to a sultan surrounded by flatterers were inevitably that the losses has been caused by traitors, by treachery, by enemies within. More purges followed. The circle of competence shrank further. Meanwhile, in the provinces, governors who had learned the rhythm of the palace, agree, never challenge, report success, ran their territories accordingly. Tax collection became extraction. Local grievances went unreported because reporting them might imply administrative failure. Unreported grievances became rebellions. Rebellions became additional evidence in the palace's internal logic of further treachery. Tragedy is that none of this was invisible to the people living inside it. The grand viziers who shuffled through the court in this period, some lasting months, one famously lasting barely weeks, understood exactly that was happening. The senior janissary officers understood. The women of the imperial harem, whose political intelligence was often sharper than anything the men produced, certainly understood. They were trapped in a system of their own making, a system where telling the truth to power had become the most dangerous act imaginable. One account, preserved in a private correspondence of the period translated by modern Ottoman scholars, describes a senior vizier writing to his brother. The Sultan hears only music. We are the men who must live with the silence between notes. Think about that. The most powerful empire in the world, governed by a man who heard only music, surrounded by men who knew the silence between the notes and chose, for their own survival, to stay quiet. Every system eventually corrects itself. The correction is rarely clean. The final act of Sultan's psychological collapse was rarely dramatic in the way films depict. There was no single moment of revelation, no confrontation, no honest speech delivered in a throne room. What happened instead was quieter and uglier. The Janissaries, who had tolerated, accommodated, and navigated the Sultan's deterioration for as long as it suited them, eventually reached a calculation. The threshold was always the same. When the Sultan's dysfunction began to threaten their power, their pay, their position, that's when the machinery of Ottoman deposition engaged. It was swift, it was practiced, they had done it before. A new sultan would be placed on the throne, pulled from the kafes, dazed, frightened, dressed in the robes of empire. The flatterers would reposition themselves, the court would recalibrate, and the cycle, without structural intervention, would begin again. What's haunting is not the deposition, it's the continuity. The same architecture remained, the same culture of performative loyalty, the same pressure on advisors to agree rather than inform, the same isolation built into the structure of imperial power. A new man in the chair didn't fix the chair, it just reset the clock. Ottoman historians writing in this period were sometimes astonishingly clear eyed about this. Kosi Bey, an advisor who submitted his famous treatise on Ottoman institutional decline in the 1630s, described with remarkable directness how the delegation of authority to flatterers and the removal of honest men from the Sultan's presence had become a structural feature of imperial governance, not an anomaly but a pattern. He was writing a warning nobody in power listened, or rather, they heard it. They agreed it was true, and then they went back to agreeing with Sultan because that was safer. It is the most disturbing thing about the Sultan who spoke to mirrors. He didn't choose madness, nobody does. He was placed from birth into a system that systematically removed every mechanism that might have kept him tethered to reality. He was isolated as a child, he was told as a young man that trust was dangerous. He was placed on a throne surrounded by people whose survival depends on his approval, and he was given absolute power, which meant that any voice that might have corrected him was also the voice he could silence. And he silenced them one by one until only the reflection remained. There is reason this story has echoed through history in empires, in boardrooms, in governments across centuries and continents. The mechanics are always the same. Power that cannot tolerate honest feedback will eventually receive only flattery. A leader surrounded only by people who agree with him is not being served, he is being managed. The mirror is not a metaphor for a madman. The mirror is what happened to any man, any person with unchecked power and a weakened grip on honest counsel. When the people around him choose survival over truth, the Sultan looked into the glass and saw a Sultan staring back. He didn't realize that the reflection was the only honest thing left in the room. If you want to understand power, real power, the kind that builds empires and destroys them, subscribe to Empireon, because the dark history of the East is not just the story of kings and dynasties. It is the story of how human nature behaves when there is no one left to tell the truth.